On the morning of September 9, 1944, a man named Earl Drummond walked through Gate 7 of the Radford Arsenal in Montgomery County, Virginia, and did not come home that night. He was 31 years old, a former coal handler from Pulaski who had traded one kind of darkness for another. His shift began at 6 a.m. His badge number was 4471. He wore steel-toed boots that his wife had resoled herself because leather was rationed. He walked a quarter-mile along a gravel path lined with chain-link fence and razor wire, past a sign that read, "Restricted Area, no cameras, no matches, no unauthorized personnel." And he entered Building 17, which smelled on the best of days like ammonia and copper and something older, something elemental, the way the air smells before lightning splits a tree in half. What happened inside Building 17 on that September morning was never formally investigated. The accident report was classified within 72 hours. The cause of death listed on Earl Drummond's Virginia death certificate read simply, "Industrial Accident." His wife received a form letter on Army Ordnance letterhead. His name was not inscribed on any memorial. The Radford Arsenal continued operating 6 days a week, around the clock, without pause. 3 weeks later, a shift supervisor named Caldwell submitted a written maintenance request for Building 17's ventilation system. The request was denied. The reason given, non-essential expenditure during wartime production conditions. Earl Drummond was not unique. He was representative. In the years between 1941 and 1945, the Radford Arsenal processed more smokeless powder and propellant charges than any single facility in American history. It supplied ammunition for every major theater of the Second World War. It employed, at its operational peak, more than 11,000 workers, predominantly women, predominantly from the surrounding Virginia and West Virginia counties, predominantly people who had never stood on a factory floor before and would never fully recover from what they found on one. And when the war ended, when the contracts shrank and the workers were discharged and the files were sealed, the U.S. government quietly reclassified the operational records of the Radford Arsenal under statutes that kept them inaccessible for decades. Not because the facility had failed, because it had succeeded beyond all projections, and what that success had cost the people inside it was too expensive an admission to allow into the public record. The decision to build what would become the Radford Arsenal was made not by military visionaries in Washington, but by a crisis of cold arithmetic. By late 1939, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps had completed its mobilization capacity study and arrived at a number that made generals go quiet in their offices. In the event of full wartime mobilization, American smokeless powder production capacity would sustain operations for approximately 4 months. After that, rifles would fire blanks. Artillery would become expensive furniture. The math was that simple and that catastrophic. The DuPont Company was awarded the design and operations contract in September 1940, a selection that had less to do with competitive bidding than with the fact that DuPont had built powder facilities before, had the institutional knowledge, and had the organizational appetite for a project of this scale and secrecy. The site selected was a bend in the New River in Montgomery County, Virginia, isolated enough for the safety buffer that powder production legally required, accessible enough for the rail connections and highway links that would keep it supplied, and large enough to accommodate the staggering footprint of what the Army needed built. Congress authorized $73 million in initial construction funding on January 14, 1941, under appropriations language that bundled the expenditure into categories designed to avoid public scrutiny. Ground was broken in February 1941 in frost-hardened Virginia clay by men who were told almost nothing about what they were building. By December of that same year, 10 months later, the first production lines were running. The speed was extraordinary. At peak construction, 14,000 workers were on site simultaneously, raising 1,100 individual structures across 4,200 acres of river bottom. Roads were graded and paved before the buildings beside them had roofs. Rail spurs were spiked into terrain that hadn't been fully surveyed. Workers were organized by sector with deliberate compartmentalization. You built your assigned section and saw nothing beyond the fence lines around it. The powder processing lines, the solvent recovery systems, the nitric acid mixing chambers, they rose out of the Virginia clay in winter fog and summer heat and were operational before most Americans knew their country was at war. DuPont's engineers designed the facility with production output as the primary variable. Safety engineering was a secondary constraint, bounded by the minimum standards necessary to keep the lines running. This was not negligence. This was doctrine. The philosophy of wartime industrial construction in America in 1941 was stated plainly in internal Army ordnance documents: build to produce, accept tolerable losses, and audit costs after victory. The men who signed those blueprints believed the accounting could wait. For many of the people who worked beneath their blueprints, waiting was not a luxury available to them. At its operational peak in 1944, the Radford Arsenal produced approximately 1.5 million pounds of smokeless powder per day, 1.5 million pounds, every 24 hours, 7 days a week during maximum production periods, 3 shifts cycling through buildings that never cooled, never dimmed, never stopped. The machinery did not have an off position. Shutting a production line down risked crystallization in the solvent circulation lines, pressure accumulation in the mixing chambers, conditions that required hours of remediation and testing before any restart could be authorized. So it ran. It always ran. The women who worked the powder lines, and it was overwhelmingly women by 1943, as male workers were pulled into military service, did not wear perfume to work. They had been told not to, because many commercial fragrances contained organic compounds that could react unpredictably with the nitrocellulose particulate that settled as a fine white dust on every horizontal surface in the production buildings, coating hair and clothing, and over months of daily exposure, the soft tissue lining of the respiratory tract. They wore cotton coveralls issued by the facility and laundered in facility washrooms, because personal clothing could carry residual static charge from synthetic materials. Their hair was tucked under cotton caps. Their shoes were wooden-soled or leather-soled. Metal, keys, hairpins, jewelry was confiscated at the gate each morning and returned at the end of each shift. The sound on the production floor was its own kind of violence. The sustained high-pitched scream of the extruder presses forcing nitrocellulose dough through precision-machined dies, layered over the rhythmic impact of the cutting drums slicing extruded strands into uniform powder grains. Underneath all of it, the hiss and shudder of solvent recovery systems and the grinding of the drying drum assemblies. Women shouted to each other from 2 feet away and could not be heard. They developed hand signals. They learned to read lips and expressions, and the angle of a shoulder turning. They built a shared language that existed only inside those buildings, among those women, during those years, and it died when they were discharged and dispersed across 3 counties and went home to kitchens and never spoke of it again. They were proud of what they did. That is what the record shows in the fragments that survived. a worker who ran an extruder press in Building 22 from spring 1943 through the end of the war, told her daughter decades later that she had felt in those years that she was making something that mattered absolutely, that could not be postponed or delegated. The powder she produced went into artillery rounds. The rounds went to places she had heard named on the radio. She made 8-hour contributions to battles with names she would learn much later and would recognize from the news of those years with a private, particular feeling of connection. That pride was genuine and total. It was also, from a management perspective, the most effective safety suppression tool available. Workers who understood their labor as moral contribution did not organize over ventilation deficiencies. The warning signs were accumulating in the facility's own internal documentation, had anyone been looking with intent to act. A 1943 operational review recorded 847 lost time injuries across the workforce in a single 12-month period, a rate nearly 4 times the DuPont corporate average at comparable chemical production facilities. Pulmonary complaints among workers with 12 or more months of continuous powder line exposure were logged under a clinical category labeled respiratory adjustment, a phrase that appears in internal correspondence with the regularity of institutional policy, as though the lungs were failing to adapt to conditions rather than being slowly damaged by them. By the spring of 1944, the facility's medical staff had begun tracking a pattern of neurological symptoms among long-service workers: persistent headaches, fine motor tremors, concentration deficits consistent with chronic exposure to acetone and ether-based solvents used in powder processing. The observations were documented in an internal memorandum. No corrective protocols were implemented. Production targets for the third quarter of 1944 were increased by 11%. The war ended in the Pacific on August 15, 1945. At Radford, production contract volume was reduced by 70% within 60 days. By December, more than 7,000 workers had been formally separated from employment with 2 weeks severance compensation and a form letter expressing governmental gratitude for their wartime service. There was no exit medical evaluation. There was no post-separation health monitoring program. There was no registry of discharged workers, no epidemiological study commissioned to track occupational health outcomes, no public acknowledgment in any accessible government document that 11,000 human beings had spent between 1 and 4 years in daily proximity to nitrocellulose processing solvents, nitroglycerin-based compounds, and acid mixing operations, whose long-term physiological consequences were, in 1945, only partially characterized in the scientific literature, and were, in the decades following the war, not investigated by the institutions that could have investigated them. The classified operational archives, production logs, accident investigation reports, internal medical summaries, maintenance denial records, and the correspondence chain between DuPont management and Army Ordnance Corps officials were transferred into federal custody under classification authority that restricted access for more than 30 years. The legal justification invoked national security. The practical consequence was the absence of a traceable paper record connecting the facility's documented operating conditions to the documented health outcomes of its former workforce. The workers had no lawyers. The lawyers worked for the other side. What had been a site of extraordinary human output became, in the language of post-war procurement planning, a strategic reserve asset. The physical plant was retained and maintained at reduced operating cost, kept in a state of partial operational readiness that required workers but not workers with institutional memory, not workers who might ask what happened to the people who came before them. The corporate and government partnership that had designed and operated Radford was restructured in 1946 under a new contract framework that insulated DuPont from liability exposure related to wartime operating conditions. The restructuring was completed in less than 4 months. The Radford Army Ammunition Plant operates today, a fact that the institutional record tends to present as evidence of enduring American industrial capacity. The original production structures from the 1941 construction period are largely demolished or remediated, replaced across decades by newer buildings for newer conflicts with newer compounds. The New River still bends around the site perimeter. The Blue Ridge ridgeline still frames the western horizon the way it framed it for every worker who walked through those gates between 1941 and 1945. The operational archives from the wartime production period were partially declassified in stages beginning in the 1980s, but the internal medical records, the respiratory adjustment logs, the lost time injury statistics, the neurological symptom tracking memoranda from 1944 remain incomplete in the publicly accessible record. Researchers who have attempted to reconstruct occupational health outcomes for wartime Radford workers have encountered archival gaps so consistent in their placement and so specific in what they exclude that they do not resemble accident. Earl Drummond's name is not on any wall. The hand signals the women on the powder lines built and used and passed between themselves across the noise and the white dust are not documented anywhere. The precise knowledge of what it meant to run an extruder press through an 8-hour shift in the winter of 1944, what it smelled like and sounded like, and what it did to a body over years, that knowledge went out the gates with the workers when they were discharged, and it did not come back in. America built this place in 10 months. It ran it until the immediate need was satisfied. It processed enough propellant to supply a world war, and then it sealed the files, discharged the labor force, restructured the liability, and spent the following decades not asking what the production had cost the people who made it possible. The wind off the New River carries no answers. It carries the smell of cold water and the sound of the current moving over stone, and nothing else.